Hey, you there, in the baby registry rabbit hole. The thing experienced parents agree on? A Nanit Smart Baby Monitor. One camera, one app for video, breathing motion monitoring, and personalized sleep insights. All in one place. Check in from anywhere, get real-time safety notifications, and capture every sleepy smile and goodnight kiss. The best part? Those insights help you get more sleep, starting night one. Add it to your registry or shop at Nanit, nanit.com.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome everyone to episode 11, and in today's episode we're adapting the abbreviation BCE from before the Common Era to before computers existed, which is going to allow us into the wonderfully interesting world of neurodiversity in the royal courts of Renaissance England and Scotland. And I am super excited to welcome a new guest, Jessica Secmezsoy-Urquhart. Have I said that right, Jessica?
Yeah, pretty much.
Wicked. So Jessica's research focuses on the vital role of disabled entertainers and courtiers in the English and Scottish royal courts of the Renaissance, specifically neurodiverse individuals who were the court fools or jesters, and bodily diverse people with their dwarfism and gigantism and similar, who were known at the time as wonders. Jessica, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, lovely to be on it.
Cool. So Jessica, you're neurodivergent as well, aren't you?
Yep. Yeah, I'm a natural fool myself. Yeah, I'm neurodiverse in a lot of things.
Yeah, well, you're in the right place. So, Jessica, as a neurodivergent individual myself, I've been known to crack jokes and play the fool, usually at inappropriate moments, to be honest. And I'm sure that yourself and other neurodivergent people listening to this are likely going to wince at similar memories, or, well, yeah, not just that, they'll also feel a sense of pride probably for those times when their humour and creativity brought relief to the people they were trying to help feel better. I think it's something on the spectrum we can be good at. I suppose it's a combination of our gifts of compassion, quick thinking, pattern recognition, creativity, empathy, and that ability to say things before we've stopped to consider the risks involved in making fun in not necessarily the right moment. But yeah, Jessica, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this, and I'm super excited to hear about your research as well. So would you mind giving us a bit of background to your work and what you've discovered about neurodivergent and other individuals with differences in, well, let's be honest, one of the most fascinating environments that are the Renaissance royal courts?
Yeah, I've always been interested in disabled stories. Obviously, living with disabilities, it's always impacted my life. It was weirdly things like Game of Thrones and a story I heard in an English language class about William the Conqueror's fall, and I think that I think he was disrupting a coronation. I don't know if it's a true story or not, but it was in my kind of mid part of my undergrad degree, and when it came to doing my dissertation, I decided to look at disabled court jesters and wonders, so people who were born with things dwarfism, gigantism. And so from undergrad to my master's and on to PhD, I've kind of just went deeper into that, specifically looking at England and Scotland and comparing England and Scotland, because they weren't completely the same in how they kind of incorporated these people. But my research kind of tries to show that the Renaissance in Europe was a particularly kind of not a golden age for disabled people, but a surprisingly inclusive period, because there was what I discussed, kind of taking it from Goffman, but turning it on its head. There was a view of people with things like neurodiversity and bodily diversity having a desired form of differentness. Natural fools who entered royal courts and got these kind of prized important positions that supported them, they were seen as naturally comedic, but also prized for having what was basically for being blunt and being honest, which is something that autistic people are still kind of known for today.
Yeah, that's no filters sort of thing.
Like, no one else would get away with that freedom of telling a monarch stuff that could be even kind of offensive. But it was basically being autistic, being neurodiverse, gave them a pass, gave them the ability to get away with doing this, and in return it gave the monarch who allowed it kind of someone from the common people who would kind of give them advice and kind of see through all the pretensions, and unlike other courtiers, speak honestly to them. And sometimes that could mean, like with Henry VIII and his most known fool, Will Somers, they could also kind of develop almost a deep compassion between each other and become companions.
So that the Will Somers example, I watched that series on the Tudors, which was epic, a few years ago, and Will Somers was in that, and he was.
Is that the Tudors? I think he's only been in the Tudors. I complain a lot about these shows because they usually cut people out, or what's it called? Is it the Mirror and the Light? I can't remember the latest Wolf Hall series. I did like the included Sexton, who was the jester before Will Somers, but they seem to be playing him as not disabled, which kind of is expected. But at least with the Tudors, he was much too old in that, but they at least seem to have him being neurodiverse in that.
Yeah, I mean, even when I watched the Tudors, Will Somers in that was. I was struck by how he reminded me of some friends of mine who were on the spectrum. You know, just that very blunt, but not just blunt and rude. They were keenly intelligent, and I think I wonder, would it be that, or could it be that sort of jesters and fools and so on were actually pretty useful, not just a relief, but actually useful in terms of, yes, you can be trusted with their honesty because they've got no filter and they can't lie. They can only tell the truth, and it's going to come out bluntly, which is obviously in high stressful situations like being a monarch, you probably appreciate that. Would it be that could it be that there was more use to the kings and also the royal families that they would be advising, or at least opening the monarch's eyes when a lot of advisors around them were probably trying to divert their attention in various ways to promote their own ends?
Yeah, in my PhD thesis, I do talk about the extent to which they could be involved in politics, and usually when neurodiverse people, they were used as symbols or by other people, like Yusuf Shapi. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. He wrote a letter to his Spanish masters where he was using an incident with Sexton to kind of show that Henry had lost his way and was kind of going off the deep end. And Sexton's kind of the one example where this trait of telling the truth doesn't work out, and it's because he referred to, in front of the king, he referred to Anne, Queen Anne, as I think it's a ribald, so like a prostitute, and called Elizabeth a bastard. And there's a description in a letter by Sharpies where he says that the king had nearly killed his fool over this, and I think it's the master of the stables or master of horse, who was part of Mary and Catherine of Aragon's kind of circle, as well as the Spanish ambassador. They took him and protected him, kind of took him in while he was kind of shamed by this action. And so he was passing this story on to show that the king is getting told the truth, according to the Spanish, and he's refusing to see sense, and he's even trying to kill the person who's meant to have that freedom to tell him the truth. it's much more, it seems to be more common though with people like Geoffrey Hudson, who was a dwarf at the royal court of Charles I and Henrietta Maria. For people like that to be able to actively take part in politics. So there is an element of disabilities kind of holding people who are neurodiverse back from full involvement in court politics, but they've got this particularly specific position themselves, which I wouldn't say is devoid of politics, but it's the fact that they're not seen as having kind of as much kind of tie to factions and kind of specific aims that makes the monarch trust them so much.
Yeah, so how close to what would be the sort of generalised view of court jesters and entertainers would you say that the neurodiverse individuals you can see that were, or do you even think that most jesters and entertainers were neurodivergent? That would be a better question, really. In fact, let's just go with that.
Yeah, I'd say until the 1600s, until the Stuart era, people in Europe who are jesters, at least in England and Scotland, are overwhelmingly neurodiverse, and it's kind of goes back to medieval kind of thought and religious belief and stuff like that. Especially, I can't remember his first name, Langland's Piers Plowman talks about kind of the positive traits of people who are neurodiverse, but also how people who are comedians, who are fake fools, things like that, will go straight to hell. And there's such a negative view of what is called artificial fools, i.e. comedians, compared to neurodiverse people, that it really is like the rise of theatre, people like Shakespeare, and the kind of notion of a clown which develops, which starts to kind of separate from kind of neurodiverse people and becomes a thing in itself. And you get artificial fools in the Stuart era like Archie Armstrong instead, who do end up getting exiled, for instance, because he used his kind of license to tell the Archbishop kind of things that he didn't really have the right to kind of say compared to someone who was neurodiverse. So it seems to be a thing that is kind of particular to Christian Europe. I think it's Bernadette Otto has a good book that talks about fools across the world, and there has been fools across history, like comedic people at courts who tend to be disabled in some way, but it's neurodiverse people that are very specific to Europe in the kind of 14 to 1600s. So it seems to be a really kind of specifically connected to religious belief and the Renaissance, compared to like how they viewed wonders, people with things like gigantism and dwarfism. That seems to be kind of a more generalised view of, well, these people are so unique that they're wonderful and we want them at court to kind of show off how grand we are and how we can have people like that here because we are the royal court. That seems to be something you get everywhere across the globe during history, but there is this particular thing about neurodiversity that medieval and Renaissance Europe really is fascinated and loves with.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's so interesting. Jessica, we're just due a break, so we're going to have a quick little break and I'm going to come back with some more. So, Jessica, do you feel there was something unique, or there is something unique about studying neurodiversity in the archaeological record in history?
Definitely is. Historian of Ideas that's called Christopher Goody. I don't agree with him on everything, but he notes that intellectual disability, as he calls it, particularly across history, has a historical slipperiness, which he basically means that, well, you can study something that's like a physical disability or deformity or quite a few mental illnesses to some extent. You can study them and they kind of tell you the same thing and we're treated the same ways across time and place in history. for studying neurodiversity, you kind of have to look at a specific time and place because it can change dramatically over time and where you're looking, which does not mean that neurodiversity didn't exist. It just means that it's kind of more open to how people view and treat it changing, because it's not leaving a physical sign for us in the same way that a lot of kind of disabilities can do. Look, why this podcast can exist is because there is physical signs and archaeological records of different disabilities, but besides a few kind of birth deformities that cause things like learning disabilities, there's really you can't look at someone's skull and say, oh, that person was autistic, that person was neurodiverse. It doesn't work like that. And that's kind of having to study a specific society to tell about neurodiversity. It helps us know what that society itself kind of viewed as important and kind of what they stigmatise. It's something that Henry Jacques Streicher, one of the kind of early forefathers of disabled history, he kind of suggested it to study disability. You have to do this, and by doing it, you're able to raise the veil on how a society views not just disability, but so many other things. And for instance, from my research, that kind of shows this interesting fact that the Renaissance was more positive about neurodiversity than we assume, that these people were kind of desired at royal courts for these positions because they were disabled, not in spite of it. And even in kind of smaller periods of time, you see amazing changes. Like currently, you're seeing a lot of people. I think Trump recently, I think it was him, but it was definitely a kind of person in his circle said that so many people were getting diagnosed with autism now that it was obviously made up, that there was some weird kind of, they were trying to correlate something that was rubbish. It's just that there's more people now who get tested.
Yeah, there's more awareness, isn't there?
Yeah, like my dad was just a kind of awkward guy, obsessed with music for most of his life, but people found him a bit weird, didn't have many friends, stuff like that, specific interests, and he recently got diagnosed with autism.
Brilliant.
So he's got that answer for why he's always been different. It's just he was kind of passed enough as neurotypical that it caused terrible problems in his life. But
so sad. Yeah, that masking is exhausting and demoralising. Has your dad's diagnosis helped him?
It's helped him. He's felt a lot. He's been able to recontextualise a lot of things about himself. It was an issue also with myself getting diagnosed, because when I was growing up, girls didn't always get diagnosed with it unless they were really obvious. And my special interests were writing, reading books, drawing, which didn't really stick out as kind of weird, whereas my sibling had like the most kind of artistic special interest from the start, which was dinosaurs. And then
of course
I think there's like, you've got history autism, and then you've got like dinosaur autism when you're young.
I think I was into my mine was football actually, but when it became
my dad liked football too, so there is proof that you can be autistic and good at sports. It's just proof of it. And it's weird if you go in the kind of perspective that these people like Trump take to the Renaissance. I can claim, for instance, that more people learning to read, write, and do maths made more people into neurodiverse people, natural fools, which obviously sounds mad, but the fact was that, especially following the Reformation, being able to read and write started to become more common and more prized. And weirdly,
that's amazing.
Through Kirk kind of documents in Scotland, and kind of court cases dealing with property of neurodiverse people, both in England and Scotland, you see that starts to be, like, people were not diagnosed medically in the Renaissance. If you had some money or property, it was kind of a concern that you had these conditions. Outside the royal court, if you were rich, it was actually a bad thing. So it wasn't this perfect period. Say if you had property and you were neurodiverse, you had to have someone make sure that you did not kind of destroy, did not mess up the kind of ownership of a big family before the next generation. So a bunch of court cases would be held, and they would examine someone, determine if they were a lunatic, which meant that they could get their property back eventually once they recovered, or if they were a fool and then an idiot. So a lot of these terms come originally from legal documents. Then that person would have someone to look over their finances and to be a kind of keeper, a guardian / carer to them for the rest of their life. And during these exams, questions over after the Reformation, the questions increasingly included questions about can you read, write, and in church life as well, especially in Scotland, it became more vital that you could read and write and participate in church society. So even in the 1500s, there's at the start of the century, arguably there's less natural fools because these things aren't as necessary. But by the end of the century, people are getting categorised, if not diagnosed, as neurodiverse, as fools, as idiots, because there is kind of more concern with this, and so more people are getting kind of falling under it. So it's the Renaissance. It's just a fascinating kind of area to zone in on regarding disability, especially
isn't it?
neurodiversity.
Isn't it just? That's amazing. I mean, so what we've basically learned there is that before reading and writing was commonplace, neurodivergent people couldn't be academics and scholars, and it wasn't necessarily as easy to find special interests like we do with reading and writing and dinosaurs and history. And then also that during the Renaissance period, they invented ADHD coaches. So that's absolutely incredible. It's so interesting as well.
It's basically like people are at the start of the century were able to be more part of church life. There was a lot of debates from people like Augustine onwards, though, whether deaf people as well, because they weren't that clued up about deafness. So it tended to be kind of dumped in with being mute or being a natural fool. These conditions were debated. Can this person truly get confession? Can they take communion? So there is this kind of debate, and as things like writing and reading become more important to society, it becomes a more disabling thing to lack them, which doesn't mean that some people with those couldn't. Like, for instance, James Hamilton, people like, I think it's James Hamilton, the women in his family, some of them were neurodiverse and they were nobility. So there was a lot of people who would have been literate and to an extent were able to kind of fully engage in society. But there was something particularly unique about the royal court where this being different was accepted. But outside, like what my first kind of hopefully peer-reviewed article is going to be about is how being rich, being of the upper ranks in the Renaissance actually made you deal with more ableism and more exclusion because you had to be a perfect daughter or son, whatever. You had to marry, you had to do certain things if you were of that stock. Whereas if you were of the lower ranks, you could enter a royal court and get these kind of really lucrative roles and get supported when a lot of the time it might be difficult outside the court for their families. So you get kind of records of people like Will Summers having, I think it's his sister visit, and you see people who got their roles possibly through their kind of parents working at the court. So as I talk about in my thesis, disabled people also enter royal courts in the ways that everyone else does, through kind of prior connections or working their way up through the nobility. And recently there was I love puppet history, but they did a video recently about Archie Armstrong, and I think they chose him because he's the first kind of well-known non-disabled one. He's an artificial fool, because a lot of people think if someone's a disabled fool, they were obviously just getting laughed at. So we don't want to study that. We want to study a proper comedian.
Wow.
And they used the story that he was a sheep stealer before he came to the court. And then he was just spotted and brought along. And that story exists for Will Summers, for so many jesters. It's the kind of idea we have of kind of people from the country being backwards and bumpkins goes back to jesters. So in literature, there was a lot of popular full literature outside the royal court that people would learn the names of these people through. And they often would come up with a made-up origin that they were from the country and spotted randomly by someone noble or royal, and that's how they got the role. There was talent spotted, and it was much more typical of other people how they entered the court. But people kind of go to the first secondary source or the first primary source they've seen and assume that that's definitely how they came to court, and it's not.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like they're just protecting the system there. Only these neurodivergent people can get away with that. They got a totally different story to the norm. So when they come in and behave differently to how the elite are supposed to behave, we can excuse that behaviour. Whereas the rest of you're not allowed to, because you're special in a different way. Does that make sense?
Yep.
That was amazing, Jessica. Thank you so much. Incredibly interesting. I have to say, it's wonderful that neurodiversity and differences are being represented more in academic research these days. It can only be a good thing.
Yeah, it's definitely something I think right now is so much more important with Trump overseas, basically getting rid of any DEI stuff. The accessibility bit's often left out, getting rid of kind of any protections for disabled people. And then over here we're deciding that, even a Labour government is deciding that we should cut benefits for disabled people at the same time as we're kind of making assisted dying easier, which as a historian, to me, it worries me. I think at this point in time, disabled history is more important than it's ever been, even following COVID. Right now, it's a really important time for us to be talking about stuff like this.
Absolutely. And I think, Jessica, I want to invite you back on for another episode, because I think we're in a great position to jump in to talk about this in greater detail, as you mentioned, ableism and especially moving on towards the rise of then eugenics and all that lot. So I'd love to have you back on the show. We are out of time for today, I'm afraid. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Can people can get in touch with you in any way, Jessica? I can always put it in the show notes.
Yeah, you can get in touch with me at Jessica Secmezsoy-Urquhart on Twitter, and I'm kind of a version of that on most platforms, or my name is totally unique. So if you look that up, you'll find.
All right, Jessica. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to our next episode. And thank you, everybody else, for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.